In this video, we're going to talk about the big controller changes and what the developers have to say about the reason they nerfed or buffed different characters. What is their goal involved in balancing changes? And in doing this, we can really look and see what the developers want as a balanced meta in the future and just how they plan to balance future changes. So we're going to break it all down, but the GameLeap website is the best place to quickly climb the ranks. If you want to get to Diamond, Immortal, or even Radiant, I've gotten so many messages of people that have far surpassed their peaks and dominated the ladder. So if you really want to climb, do yourself a favor and go check it out right now down below. Now, this article is titled Deep Dive into 404 and its controller agent changes. So this is from Jay Watford, who is the lead agent designer on Valorant, and he's really gonna break down a lot of these agent changes and talk to us about the reason that things were balanced in what way. So first off, the controller role. Quote, to start, it might be helpful to share a shorthand we use internally to group some controllers together. We call Brimstone, Omen, Astra the Dome Smokers, and these three tend to come up together in conversation. Viper's smokescreen often puts her in her own category of discussion since her main source for cover is less interchangeable than the other controllers because their changes are more internal. We'll discuss Viper in her dedicated section below. For subscribers of the channel, you know that I often say this same shit. Maybe I'm secretly a developer. Quote, when looking at the Dome Smokers, we had two goals that drove our path forward. One of these goals is data-driven, the other is rooted in design philosophy. When it comes to data, these three are pretty healthy in both win rate and presence until you get into higher MMRs, where Astra's presence becomes dominant. In pro play, Astra's stranglehold becomes far more pronounced and crowds out other Dome Smokers on every map. We want to drive more choice, competition, and diversity in coordinated play and unlock teams to adopt different play styles and methods, which leads us to our design philosophy. One of our driving philosophies for agents is that they are sharp, meaning they provide clear strengths and weaknesses while unlocking distinct strategic possibilities. We felt like Dome Smokers was really struggling here, Omen and Brimstone's strength felt unpronounced, and Astra seemed capable of replicating everything they brought to the table. For 4.04, we try to define and sharpen the play patterns that each agent should individually excel at and give them all a reason to be picked or left behind. Now, before we move on, I really need to talk about what he said about Astra's presence being dominant in the higher MMRs and in pro play. One of the problems that can be very difficult to balance is a character like Astra, where in the average or low ranks of play, Astra saw very little play, and compared to how she was before, she is just a lot weaker. So if she already saw low play there, then she's gonna see even less, if any at all. And other smoke characters that already saw play are gonna see more play. But the core of Valorant often comes down to top-down balance, right? They have to make sure that the meta at the pro level in the high ranks of play as well are balanced to an appropriate degree. And for some, that's gonna mean that Astra doesn't see any play in your rank, but for others, it's gonna mean that Astra isn't dominant in your rank. So it's a sacrifice or an exchange that has to be made, or else the high ranks and pro play could have a really atrocious meta if you try to make things perfectly balanced for a lower rank, and then things become overpowered when skill improves in the higher ranks. This could lead to people misevaluating how strong Astra still is or how strong Astra was, because in their ranks, they never saw her, but it is important to understand a lot of this balance is done top down. Anyways, moving on. So specifically about Brimstone, he says, quote, not only did we seek to sharpen our old dog Brimstone's identity within the roster, we wanted to define clearer strengths for his weaknesses, a limited smoke range, and a number of smokes. Our intent was to make quality of life changes while doubling down on playstyles that help Brimstone execute in the moment with his team. Our goal with Brimstone's identity is to be a controller option for players who prefer to quickly execute and surprise the enemy team. Hence the stim beacon, hence the faster dropping smokes. Our hope is that the improvements to his smoke ability will elevate Brimstone's competition in terms of dome smoke output when compared to other controllers. We tied this into stim beacon changes, adding a small speed boost with rapid fire, which should give Brimstone a means to give his team a clear signal that it's time to get going. This should hopefully make the stim beacon less situational so that Brimstone's strengths can show every round. His old knees are gonna kill after this though. So Honestly, that's actually pretty smart the way that they did this, and I did like the combination of a faster dropping smoke with an ability that encourages your goddamn team to stop baiting and push the fuck in. It's really nice, and I definitely like it. Now, next up, they talk about Omen. Quote, as a strategic diversity within the controller role evolved in the past year, Omen was found hiding in the shadows, but we see him. All right. Our intent is to carve out a niche for Omen amongst the controllers that better emphasizes his strengths, and on the flip side, limiting the weaknesses that were cumbersome for allies to play around. When looking at the comparable dome smokes, the obvious drawback for Omen is his lack of burst and inability to block out multiple angles instantly. We believe this is a healthy weakness, but it's exaggerated and hard to play off as an ally. When compared to others, Omen spends a generous amount of time deploying multiple smokes, waiting for the travel time, and then waiting for them to settle. We paired increased projectile speed and reduced cooldown to sharpen Omen in a high-frequency dome smoker role, someone that is capable of delivering pressure and misdirection throughout a round, while still trading off the burst efficacy that Astra and Brimstone are capable of. The remainder of Omen's kit is more combat focused than other controllers, a strength worth emphasizing and bringing some quality of life to. Moving Paranoia spawn forward should reduce instances of blinding adjacent allies, and shorter shrouded step timings are more in line with comparable movement abilities in Valorant. We don't want Omen moving around like Jet, but this will enable him to be a bit more elusive. And in all actuality, I do love a lot of the changes with Omen. I honestly think that they could have made it so that he couldn't blind his teammates at all with Paranoia, but perhaps that would have been a little bit too powerful with a rush composition where he could, flash in a straight line as his team are pushing forward. But at the end of the day, I do think that they have elevated Omen in the strengths that he has and made him a worthy adversary to some of the other options, but it's going to take some time to fully see how his identity stacks up against the more powerful Brimstone and the Astra that has gotten neutered, and I'm especially interested in the higher ranks and the pro ranks of play, where I still do think that Astra is strong enough to thrive in those environments with very high skill and coordination, but we'll have to wait and see on that one to be sure. Now, I'm not going to read everything they say about Astra, but the big statement that they make here is, quote, in order to create healthy space for our other dome smokers, Astra needs to cede ground. Basically, the pre-patch Astra Wind Mastered had way too much power and way too much flexibility in what she provided, and they really wanted to, one, longer her cooldown so it made every single decision much harder to make with every single piece of utility, and then on top of that, shrink her stars so she could no longer use them in ways like doubling up the same choke or trying to completely smoke off an entrance and then having a star left over to actually play post plan, or maybe even 2 stars. This makes it a lot more difficult to do this, and I do think that this is going to put Astra into the realm where other controllers can actually compete with her, because, the buffs to these other controllers were minuscule compared to the nerf that they gave Astra. The nerfs that they gave Astra were gigantic, and the buffs were, substantial, but not, maybe, a 15-20% buff compared to like a 40% nerf on Astra. And even with that, I still think at the higher ranks of play, Astra will still see a lot of play, because with that skill, that discipline around the character, she still potentially provides so freaking much in a way that is very different from her other dome smoker counterparts. And the last character that we got to talk about is Viper, and they do mention that Viper stands far separate from the other quote-unquote dome smokers because her role is very different in the way in which she smokes is a straight line, which is going to be very useful in some situations, and other characters cannot replicate it. They go on to state, quote, Viper's smokescreen and toxic orb abilities push her into the controller sentinel hybrid that we like, but as we've buffed her and released maps with more open space, she's become both a must-have controller and best in roster sentinel in too many situations. To balance her double role, we think it's important she has a clearer downside when compared to other agents that carry a more singular focus. Our main goal with patch 4.04 is hitting Viper's most oppressive sentinel aspects. Through some changes, we will hit her offensive output as well. Now, many of you know all of her changes: the reduction to acid, the increased smoke cooldowns, and some other small changes here or there. And more than anything, I got a lot of negative reaction towards these changes from Viper mains. A lot of people are very upset. A lot of Viper mains are very upset They say the problem is Astra, it's not Viper. And the thing that you need to understand is even with all of these changes, Viper is still going to be absolutely dominant, and it's for this exact thing we talked about. She is not a dome smoker. There are only 4 controllers in the game, and 3 of them are dome smokers, meaning that they fulfill a certain thing. They can smoke off certain specific choke points, but Viper's toxic screen can smoke off an entire section of a point, which means for retakes on certain maps, and specifically for takes on some of these open maps like Breeze, Viper is absolutely essential and needed, and all of these changes don't really matter towards that goal because there's no replacement in mind. Think about it. If you deleted her snakebite, like she just didn't have that as an ability at all, and maybe even her toxic orb, she didn't have that either, and she only had her toxic screen and her ultimate, would you still play her on Breeze? Yes, pros would as well. She is needed for that map because she does something that the other controllers cannot do. But maybe this is an argument that in actuality, what they need is another non-domed smoker, right? They need a smoker that can do something like Viper can do. And remember, when we really think about it, there are 3 dome smokers, right? And each of them have power in different ways. They talk about Viper as being this Sentinel controller hybrid, which they want to keep, but what about not a Sentinel controller hybrid? What about an ultimate controller? Someone that can fulfill the same types of smokes as Viper. Maybe a straight line smoke that splits the map. Maybe they can do both. A straight line smoke, a single targeted smoke, and they have less utility, but they're far better as a specific controller. There's a lot of ways in which you can push that, but the fact of the matter is they acknowledge that Viper stands alone from the other controllers, and that is why she's needed, because she brings something to the table that nothing in the entire game also brings to the table. And, you know, diversity, in my opinion, is always great, and I do think that if they introduced another controller that could do the same role or the same thing that Viper could in some capacity, that would do a lot more to eat up her pick rate than any amount of nerfs would ever do without fundamentally ruining her character identity, which no one wants. Now, that being said, I really want to hear your opinion about all this down below. What changes did you like about this patch, and what did you not like? And if you were to make or design a controller agent in the future, definitely let me know what you would make, what abilities would you have, and how would you create someone who eats up Viper's pick rate share. I want to hear about all that down below, and while you're there, the GameLeap website is the best way to quickly climb with in-depth VOD reviews, tips and tricks, map guides, weapon courses, and so much more. If you want to click every head and dominate and climb easily, go check it out right now in the links down below.